Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened to my voice last week. How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all having a wonderful day. In this week's build, we're making a modern picture frame using two specific jigs that I'll talk about that's going to help us cut precision miter joints, and it's also going to help us strengthen those joints. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Alright, so what I have today is some rough cut cherry and a couple of pieces of maple. Of course, you're not going to need this many pieces for your picture frame, at least not for one. Anyway, I am batching out a whole bunch today because we need some picture frames in the house. So this is of course in rough cut right now. It needs to go through the jointer, the planer, to get it to be flat and square on three sides. I am also going to opt to pass this through the drum sander just to get a more refined thickness because I find that the planer doesn't necessarily leave the cleanest finish. And I'm also going to pre-sand everything to get pretty much the material ready to go. Okay, so we have our lumber that has been milled to be flat square. We've sanded it and it's pretty much ready to go as far as final dimensioning and profiling for this particular picture frame. However, before we get into that, there's one really important thing that I wanted to mention, and that is standardize everything. I know it seems very dramatic, but really it's important because if you make this type of picture frame over the course of different batches and different periods of time, and you've got artwork or pictures or things like that that you've hung around the house in different places, and maybe at some point you need to bring them together because you changed your mind about your decor, and then your wife points out to you that hey, do those two picture frames look different? And then you go ahead and measure, and it turns out, sure enough, they are different because you didn't standardize them, and now you have to make picture frames all over again. Or you have to live with that for the rest of your life, and frankly, I would rather make the new picture frame. So standardize everything for your sanity, but also you want to make sure that if a customer buys a picture frame like that from you, in the future they can rely on that picture frame to be the exact same profile so that no matter how they hang it around their house, it matches, it goes well together, and they don't look different from each other. In that spirit, the material that I always go for is 4/4 inch, of course, rough cut material, and I always mill it down to 7/8 inch because from 4/4 to 7/8 you usually get them to be flat and square without too much loss of material. But even if it's a little bit warped, you can still get it down to 7/8 without a problem. So that's the first thing when it comes to standardization. Typically, whenever I cut them out, I usually rip them at 1.5 inches in width, but that actually turns into the height or the depth of the picture frame. Well, it'll make more sense later on. And then for the profile, I usually do 3/8 of an inch here for the little overhang. I standardize all of that just to make things easier for myself, like I said, and it will save you a lot of headache. Okay, so with that spiel being said, let's get into cutting this profile, and then let me show you what the profile actually looks like, and we'll put this thing together into an actual picture frame. Alright, so we've just gone ahead and made basically an L-shape picture frame profile, and what we're going to need to do now is cut all of these precisely into 45 degrees, or at least the joining forces are going to become 90 degrees, and let me show you the jig that we're using to do that. So this is my picture frame making jig. There's nothing that's special about this. There's a bunch of folks on YouTube that has jigs just like this, and they probably do a much better job of explaining how to make this than I can at this point in time. But the one main distinction about this jig relative to everyone else that I've seen is the usage of T-tracks instead of a framing square. And the added bonus is you can use the stop block onto the T-track itself, and so it's a little bit more efficient in terms of the build. When it comes to this jig, one of the most important thing about it is not necessarily that this angle bisects these two and is a perfect 45. That's almost irrelevant. What's more important is that this right here is a perfect 90, because when you're making cuts, you've got a piece that you go in here and you're making, cut A, right? You make the cut, and then you move it over to this side and you make the next cut. You've got a side and a B side, and as long as you kind of do all of those cuts in that way, they all will come together at 90 degrees pretty much no matter what, because of the way this jig works. So that's the magic of this jig. You don't have to try to asymptotically approach a perfect 45, which is hard to do, and this will let you get perfect 90s pretty much every time, bang on. So with all of the miters cut, all that's left to do is to glue this all together. I'm just using Titebond 3 here, and we're just going to, nothing fancy, just going to smother it on here on the corners. And as far as bringing this 45-degree miter together and clamping options go, there's a lot of options out there. You can use band clamps, you can use parallel clamps, and that'll work pretty well. You can even just use tape all the way around and just pull it real tight, and that actually works pretty well too. But for me, when it comes to picture frames, I really like to use these spring clamps, and there's a tool that kind of pulls them apart. It's got a little point in here, and those points bite into the material, and they do a really good job of applying the right amount of pressure at the right spot. They do leave a little bit of an impression mark. It's not that big of a deal once everything is said and done. It really disappears unless you're really looking for it. But overall, I really love the way these work, how simple they are, and the amount of pressure they apply. They just work really, really well for picture frame making. Alright, so after the glue has dried overnight, I decided to take off all of the spring clamps and I mounted the picture frame on this miter spline jig. So whenever we do 45 degrees, that is an end grain to end grain joinery, we do need to reinforce it with something like a miter spline. If you're curious about this jig, I do have a build video on this particular project. I'll put it in the link in the description below. But for now, let's go ahead and take a couple of passes and get our miter splines cut. And I'm going to go ahead and put in a little bit of glue in the slot that we just cut. Spread that around. And then we can take a contrasting piece of wood and wedge that in there. We can then trim the excess using a flush trim saw. Alright, so I've got a piece of glass that I just cut to size. Hopefully this is going to fit nicely. And this is the piece of artwork that I've been meaning to hang in my garage for a long time. It is 53 types of wood and where they come from and what the trees look like. I just thought it was really, really cool. And finally, I've got a backer board, or I think this is called a hardboard, that I cut to size. And I usually use this as a backer to my picture frames. And then I'm going to use a point drive gun to be able to keep everything nice and flush. And last but not least, the hanging wire. Just gonna feed that through the D-ring. And there we have it. Well, that's all for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you did, please be sure to hit the thumbs up button. Consider subscribing to the channel if you're not a subscriber already. Thank you so much for watching. I greatly appreciate your support, and I will see you on the next one.